Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Right, the first talk in this session is going to be by Nick Harding. Nick is a PhD student from the University of Manchester, and he's going to be talking about work he's doing with machine learning, particularly Bayesian networks, and applying it to terminologic data sets. And I'm sure it's going to be interesting for some of the folks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm not quite sure where everyone is, but right, we'll get started. So, I'm Nick Harding from the University of Manchester, and I'm going to talk to you about some work that I've been doing regarding Bayesian networks and the application of Bayesian networks to sort of complex health data sets. Right. So, well, first of all, I'm going to tell you a bit about my background. I'm an epidemiologist, I guess. So machine learning is not what I started out doing, but it's a technique that I'm going to try and use. Okay, fine. Let's see. Right. Okay. Thank you. So, the obesity epidemic. Obesity is a big public health problem at the moment. It's incredibly expensive for governments. Diabetes drugs are massively expensive. We have, sorry, I'm just going to start the whole thing again because it just feels like we're not even going. Is that okay? You sure? Right. I'm very sorry. Okay, so I'm Nick Harding from the University of Manchester. I'm going to be talking to you about Bayesian networks and applying them to complex health data sets. I'm an epidemiologist by training, which means that we kind of come from it from a very conventional angle. We start off with a dependent variable, then you go through the data, you look for variables that may influence that, and you look for confounders, and you try and draw conclusions about which variables have an impact on the dependent variable. But the machine learning approach means we have a more organic approach to the problem, so that we don't identify a dependent variable. We instead go through the data and try and pull out from that data relationships between variables. So the work that we've been doing is applying Bayesian networks in an attempt to model health data sets. Right, so the data set that we're applying this to is to Health Survey for England, which is a big health survey carried out since 1991 that gives us lots of data on the health of the UK population. So obesity is a big problem. It's incredibly expensive for governments. It's risen pretty much continuously since the late 60s, early 70s. It puts an intense strain on health resources. Diabetes drugs are incredibly expensive. There's massively increased risks of coronary heart disease, some cancers. So it puts an incredible burden on national health and in terms of cost. The most galling thing about obesity is that it's entirely preventable. There's no great mystery about how it's caused or what the solution is. So at the root of it, it's a very, very simple problem. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to give you, this is the outline of the talk. First of all, I'm going to give you the problem with what I will refer to as traditional epidemiological methods, which are the approaches that epidemiologists would traditionally take. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what Bayesian networks are. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the technique we use within Bayesian networks, which is important sampling. Then we'll go through results and conclusions and current and future work. Okay, so obesity is a disease or a social problem that is inherently linked with disadvantage and deprivation. It has probably a slightly unfair reputation of being a disease of the working poor or the disadvantaged. And it's undeniable that obesity it doesn't affect all social groups equally. Diet quality varies by deprivation and education. Physical activity levels vary by education and age and sort of social advantage and disadvantage. So it has a very, very complex relationship with socio-demographic factors. These socio-demographic factors are highly correlated to one another, which means that when you run a sort of what you'd call a traditional epidemiological model, such as logistic regression, you get problems with bias between the covariables in your model. Bayesian networks can begin to approach some of these problems in quite an interesting way, and we can deal with these correlated covariables in a way that isn't possible using logistic regression. Okay, so essentially what we did is we took the health survey for England 2006 data and applied a Bayesian network to model that data. We then used a Markov chain Monte Carlo approach to iterate through different networks which represent the relationships between the data, and we can use the likelihood of that network to score the likelihood of a given network topology, and then we choose the most important topologies, the best fitting topologies, and then we take an average of all those topologies to form an estimate of the expected topology, which is what I'm going to talk to you about now. The two data sets that we examined we examined male data and female data, and if you look at the two average graphs, the expected topologies of male data and female data, we can begin to infer some differences between the two. Okay, so Bayesian networks. Some of you will be very familiar with these, and others less so. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief introduction to them. All they are is a graphical representation of a probability distribution. One node in a network represents one variable in your data set. An arc between two nodes encodes a conditional dependency between those two nodes. And we can say they are composed of a topology, which is the presence of arcs between nodes, for example, A to B, A to C, and the parameters. The parameters are the numbers associated with the probabilities in these arcs. Right. So for a given Bayesian network, so if in this example, in our health survey for England data set, we have 17 variables that we're examining. So if we have these 17 nodes, each one node representing a variable, we have arcs between nodes. And the presence of those arcs between nodes defines our network structure. And we can score the likelihood of that network structure. The principle here is that we want to estimate the likelihood or the probability of the network topology, which is designated by H here, given the observed data. And all I want you to take away from this slide is that we can get an estimate of the probability of that topology given the data by calculating the probability of the data given the topology. So for a given topology, we can then say, if this topology is true, what is the probability that we generate the observed data from this topology? And that gives us an estimate, so which tells us how good or how likely a certain topology is. Right. So with this scoring mechanism, we can start with a network structure. We can then score this network structure. Then what we do is perturb the network in some way. We might add an arc to it, remove an arc to it, reverse an arc to come up with a new network. Then this new network can be scored as well. And then the Markov chain component of the process is we select the new network with a probability and weighted by its likelihood. So the more likely networks are more likely to be proposed and more likely to be accepted when they are proposed. Right. So to move between networks, we used 4 moves. The standard add, remove, and reverse, and this novel edge reverse move by Grigoriak and Husemeyer, which was done in 2008, which is shown to improve mixing between Bayesian networks. Okay, so when we import and sample, we sample a network, and then we suggest other networks, and then we sample another network. So we end up with a large distribution of sampled topologies. And then from this sample of topologies, we can take the mean of these topologies, and that mean provides an estimate of the expected topology. So, if we look at this graph here, this is the average network of the relationships between obesity-related variables in males. Now, if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, we have the physical activity variables. We have incidental physical activity, occupational physical activity, and recreational physical activity. And in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the energy intake variables. Each of these connections between nodes represents the proportion of networks that were seen with a link between these two nodes in. So this represents the average topology. A black arc represents, tells us that the arc was present in all observed topologies. A red arc implies that it was present in a slightly larger fraction, above 10%, and below in every network. And a yellow implies that it was present in less than 10%. I color-coded it simply because if you start putting proportions on every arc, the graph becomes very, very busy. Right, so this is the same graph, but with females. So we can begin to see that the relationships, the correlations between those present in female data is quite different to that in male data. So what I'm going to look at now is the recreational physical activity, the impact on recreational physical activity. So if you look on the left-hand side, in males, age is strongly associated. We can see from that one in that arc between age and recreational physical activity that that an arc was present between age and recreational physical activity was present in every network we observed. Whereas if we look at the women's topology, we don't see any influence of age on recreational physical activity at all. But what we do see is a very strong effect of education on recreational physical activity. And what we can begin to say about this is that we can begin to perhaps identify these correlations and say, in women, education and social class are much more important determinants of what makes women do physical activity. We want to know what's associated with these physical activity levels in women. Whereas men, it seems that social class and education isn't so much a barrier to their physical activity levels. It's determined largely by age and fairly independently of education and social class. Similarly, we see here, if we look at fruit and vegetable intake, in both groups, we see that fruit and vegetable intake, that box there, fruit and vegetables, is largely determined by social class in both groups. There are some relationships, and we can see that the food intake variables tend to be quite clustered. Fried food, for example, so that tells us that the level of fried food consumption is fairly closely associated with fruit and vegetable consumption. Right. When I discussed important sampling, we have something called we have problems with something called mixing, which is where our network that we're migrating through struggles to find the best network topologies. And we can see here, I have 3 traces there that found, the optimal, or what I'm fairly confident is the optimal topology, and one that doesn't. So this one network, we have a very peaked likelihood distribution. So that means that if we look at the very dark graph, it really struggles to move into areas of high likelihood from that point. So that indicates we have a trough, a likelihood trough, and it's difficult even over 1 million iterations. It's extremely unlikely that it will be able to move from that position to that position. So that's one problem we have with mixing. Right. So as I said earlier, men and women, looking at that data, men and women have greatly different determinants of recreational physical activity, and we can actually begin to determine these differences, and we can test differences in the observed arcs by testing the proportions of times an arc is observed using just a simple binomial proportion test, because we're just sampling from a distribution, so all we're left with is a proportion which we can actually test between males and females. I know that social class is highly correlated with fruit and vegetable intake in both males and females. So we can this might be used to policymakers to perhaps suggest, to identify relationships they may be able to look at. And further, ethnicity is also correlated with energy intake indicators. Right, so what we have at the moment is a distribution of possible topologies for our network. This kind of forms, in the future we can actually, all we're left with is a sample of topologies, which actually isn't actually any use for making predictions about the proportion of males, for example, that have recreational physical activity. This is just an indicator of correlation between two. Right, so the next step is to start learning some parameters we have a network so we can perhaps suggest what proportion of men are in a certain group of physical activity and what proportion of men eat the recommended amount of fruit and vegetables. To do this, you're going to average across a large number of topologies to make sure that we have the best possible network fit. Okay. So if you look at the graph, I deliberately didn't include any weight status outcome. Instead, we have the energy intake and the energy intake and energy output variables. The introduction of weight status is the data is there in the Health Survey for England data in the Health Survey for England, but we didn't include it because if you can imagine, the current BMI status of somebody isn't really, in terms of intervention, isn't as relevant as their energy intake and expenditure, because these are the targets for our intervention. These are what we're interested in changing, not necessarily the weight status. Okay. Right. So what we're looking at now is using Microsoft's infer.net to model, to start modeling weight status and impact of these for all the energy intake and expenditure variables on weight status, and we're looking at using infer.net to model that. I'm sure a few of you are aware of what infer.net is. It's a framework for performing inference in Bayesian networks and with other models. So we're going to start using infer.net, and we've started to build the model, put the topologies into the network, so we can begin to try and identify the relationship with weight status. We can also fit a latent variable between energy intake and expenditure variables, which is going to represent energy balance, and from that we can start to make inferences about what will happen to weight status given those outcomes. Okay, so thanks for listening. Are there any questions?
Any questions?
We also have an application studying childhood obesity, correlation with patient data and environmental data. My question for you is that this is a very interesting application, and the problem we're facing is a real problem. Like for us, is have over 300,000 patient records, and also the environmental data dimension is over 100 dimensions. And I was wondering if your model can predict or find some correlations in such high volume of data and such high dimension.
It gets difficult, is the short answer. Because when you have such a large data set, you have very, very, very small likelihoods. Which means that when you're trying to move between topologies, you have your distribution is very peaked. So your sampling, if you're using Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling, it becomes very difficult. You can optimize and find a good fit network, but I think I'd struggle to find it on such big, and use it on such big data sets. This technique certainly.
Yeah, first just one comment about the previous question. When you have that much data, you probably don't have to use Monte Carlo, just use
Yeah.
the algorithm. There's another Microsoft tool called WinMine that can easily handle problems of that size if you want to give it a try. My question is, have you looked at the sensitivity of your results to the priors that you used?
No. But the data sets are very, very large, so I'm not sure that the contribution of the prior would make is a relatively small proportion of the final likelihood. So my feeling is that it probably wouldn't, but I haven't actually investigated using other priors for topology.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Right, let's thank the speaker again.